Thank you. Thank you for being here. Of course, most of you actually were at our testimonial dinner last year where the Prime Minister was our host, and he started off the evening by saying that he loved being in a room where everyone would rather speak with Katie and Jerry than with him. And as we know, many of us know that that is indeed true, so we're delighted to have this moment with Katie this morning. Of course, as a woman in Ottawa, there's no doubt that since you've arrived in Ottawa, there have been more women in particular that have been nominated, celebrated, sponsored, promoted, and it's clear. And I know that many of us in the room have these kind of that was Katie moments when we see the Canada-US Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative and many different initiatives that have been brought together. So thank you for that. You've been working behind the scenes for years on diversity and inclusion in politics, and an architect of the greater representation in cabinet and the government we see today. When will you know that you've achieved lasting change?
So a simple answer about me, because that's a big question. That's actually one of the tougher questions, those big open questions. I think on a very personal level, it'll be when Jerry and I both get invited to talk about public policies that are beyond gender, and when we're not talking numbers as often as I do in these conversations, where I'm not making the case for diversity and inclusion, or for inclusion rather, because we all know that diversity is a fact in this country. When we're not having to make the case for it, I think that will be success. When the conversation changes to a deeper level. I keep having to be reminded by people around me and sometimes by critics out there and where the stories go that the case still needs to be made. The numbers still need to be, we still need to count. We still need to take note of who's in the room and who's not in the room and who should be in the room. And I think so long as we're doing that, we're not at the next level. I don't know that there is one success, one perfect image, because I think there's always going to be, to different degrees, groups of people that we need to be thinking about whether they're involved properly or not. Hopefully it's not 50% of the population, and hopefully we are better represented on diversity beyond gender, and we can be a case study for the world in this country. But we're not there yet. So maybe when we're a case study for the world, that will be the time.
Case study for the world. That's a good goal. So how long a game is this?
I think change can happen very quickly. Having said that, change can be reversed very quickly. So I think that, and just to give an example, in the election campaign, I tweeted about this because my husband sent me a note and said how my son, who at the time was 4, said to my husband, do men vote? And some of you may know my husband is he was a pundit on television talking about politics a lot, and so he said, where's that question coming from? And he said, well, because mummies run campaigns. And he just out of the mouths of babes, and we had a great laugh about it. But it really struck me that for him, in the 2015 campaign, all 3 campaign directors for the 3 major parties were women. And so that is what he knows. Having said that, that could change very quickly if all the next future campaigns had all men at the table. And that 4-year-old memory, as we know, doesn't necessarily last later into your life. And so it can be crowded out by many other memories. So I think it's a long game for us to sustain the change that we want to have happen. It doesn't need to take us as long as it sometimes feels like it is to make the change itself actually happen.
One of my sons had the unfortunate idea of asking me why there was an International Women's Day, because women had so many opportunities, and he sees them front and center at school. So a similar story in terms of wondering and not fully understanding that history. So over the past several months, the MeToo movement has taken Canada and the world by storm. Can you talk a bit about, I know that you've done a lot in terms of bringing on political staff and talking about the gender experience within politics. Can you talk a bit about your path from that perspective?
So the MeToo movement, I think, is it's a painful and uncomfortable experience that I think it has brought on all of us, men and women. But it's an incredibly important one. And one that I think workplaces, all workplaces, need to be grappling with and openly talking about. And I think that's what makes it uncomfortable and sometimes painful, is because we learn things about ourselves and about our colleagues that can be very difficult, and where there's not necessarily clear answers on how to even answer them when they tell you a story, whether it be about something they've experienced, about your own behavior, about their behavior that they're wondering about or learning about. But those conversations are essential. And change, actually, I have been seeing change happening pretty quickly. And what I think is so exciting about this movement, and the Time's Up movement that has flowed from it, is the institutional changes that we're seeing flow from this cultural change. And we've talked about this, that over time, more often than not at public policy forum like places in government, you talk about the law sort of from a top-down, what you're going to introduce in Parliament that can change things. And I think with the Me Too movement, we're actually starting to see, it's probably one of the biggest and best examples of cultural change driving institutional change. And it's up to us as a government, it's up to us in workplaces to pick up the mantle and really make that institutional change real. Mm-hmm. And so in the budget, we started to do a number of things on that front from a government standpoint. And some of those things happened pretty quickly, and because of the Me Too movement, mm-hmm. Because of the attention that was being given, the learning that was happening, the kind of cabinet and government we had, where there was an exceptional team who just saw what was happening and said, what can we do? Mm-hmm. And so there was funding put into legal aid and into rape crisis centers, as well as into a number of public policy programming initiatives that I think we'll see some really positive results from and that will help people. But there's a lot more to do. I actually think how we manage in our respective workplaces is even more complicated than putting funding into some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the budget, the 2018 budget is gender, and with all of the aspects of the budget undergoing the gender-based analysis plus. So let's start with that. What are you seeing that GBA Plus is changing in policymaking? Or have you seen it?
I absolutely have. Yeah. I often hear the examples of childcare or what are stereotypically viewed as women's policy areas that are brought up as to why GBA Plus is useful. And yet where I have had the most profound moments in terms of understanding the benefits of the GBA Plus analysis has actually been on what you would see as sort of the non-traditional areas. So for example, big infrastructure projects. When you apply GBA Plus lens to that, I, to be honest, wouldn't have known what would have come from that in terms of the conversation. But because of that lens, a conversation happens about how if you have a big infrastructure project somewhere, you're going to have a whole lot of new workers probably coming to that neighborhood, to that community, and a lot of those workers are likely to be men. What does that do? What does that change in the community? Do you need to mitigate for the change in population in any ways? Hearing those conversations wouldn't happen, I'm quite certain, if the GBA Plus lens wasn't driving that kind of a conversation as to how is this going to affect the community and different elements of the community. And the plus means it's not only asking us to look through the lens of women, but to look through all diverse groups. And frankly, some GBA Pluses, as the clerk knows sitting there, some GBA Pluses analyses that we see are done much better than others, but even that commentary is something that's new. when people are saying to each other, when ministers are saying to each other, when deputy ministers are saying to each other, when chiefs of staff are saying to each other, well, that one really didn't say much. Is it because it wasn't well done, or is there really not a lens on this one? And that's a new conversation happening around every single area of public policy that I don't think we saw before, and that is truly all about inclusion.
Fantastic. So this is a growth summit, and clearly you and I believe gender equality is a part of the growth story.
Hopefully more than you and I do.
Yeah, exactly. What do you say when you find yourself having to explain this to other people?
So some of the, probably the best and biggest example that is a case study to the world, I hope, now is our gender parity cabinet.
Yes.
And so I use that because it's not only a case study to the world, and we've seen at least one other country now that has followed suit. And I think it's a case study to all of us as to how tables can be and how they can be, how having those voices changes the conversation. And I genuinely believe, and it's not only gender, and the budget was about equality, and our cabinet table is extremely diverse. And I feel it in conversations, whether it's the GBA plus piece, and it's always tricky because I can't tell you what's in those conversations. But for example, you might imagine that conversations happening, in the hallways even, are very different when you're talking to a millennial about legalizing cannabis, about medically assisted dying, about any number of topics, than it is talking to someone who has crossed the threshold into senior citizenship and is a grandparent, perhaps. Someone from a community in rural Canada and urban Canada, someone who is a person of color, someone who's Indigenous, and of course, having the number of women at the table we have refugees, but having the number of women that we do at the table who can ensure that the voices are amplified and heard, and ensures that conversation changes in terms of, I have heard names of, you hear descriptions of how, I really find the cannabis conversation the most interesting one, because you see the generational change, you see a gender divide between mothers, fathers, grandparents, and I think if you didn't have all those voices around the table, it's harder for Canadians to trust that you've taken into consideration what they might be thinking, what they might be feeling. And you can go out and consult, all kinds, but if they only see one type of Canadian at the table, can they truly feel represented at that table? Now, we have to talk back to them to make sure that they really, because it's not all just kind of see her to be her kind of attitude, but I think it's extremely important that Canadians see themselves reflected around boardroom tables, and to me, the cabinet table is the ultimate boardroom table in our country.
Yeah, absolutely, and we definitely do. We spoke earlier this morning about AI, and this afternoon we're talking about labor markets in an AI world. So there's some research recently released from the World Economic Forum saying that women are, again, going to be left behind in an AI world. And what are we going to do to level that playing field?
So I think I know you just heard from Minister Baines, and he's a huge advocate to ensure that we are staying focused on both staying ahead in the AI field, and I know you've got some amazing leaders, some of whom I got to see at dinner last night in the room, who are working as part of the supercluster and more broadly on AI. And there was just last week or 2 weeks ago, time is a bit of a blur in this job, but there was the first ministerial for the G7, the future of, and it was themed future of work. And they talked a lot about AI, and in that conversation, and actually coming out of that G7 ministerial, and it was not only Minister Baines, it was also Minister Haidu, who previous to her current ministerial job, she was the Minister of Status of Women, and is a big advocate for gender equality. And the two of them made sure that in they've put together, I think it's 500 workplace, was one of the announcements coming out of the Future of Work Summit, 500 workplace positions for students. And there's going to be a real focus on ensuring that women are part of, and that young women are getting a significant number of those work placements. And I think just the more we can be encouraging women in STEM, just as we were hearing earlier, and I'm sure you're hearing throughout the conference, the better. And we need to do more of that, both through the education system, and the provinces are working away at that, but also in terms of we put a fair bit of effort into that from the federal government as well, in terms of programming around the primary, secondary school system and into post-secondary. But there's a lot of work to do still on that front. And it's a conversation that I think we're going to see in more than one ministerial, not just the first one. So that was the first one, and that was one of the main themes. So I expect we're going to hear a lot more of it in the coming months, and I know certainly the ministers are intending to keep being big advocates on this subject.
Okay, good. So there's been some criticism in trade policy circles in terms of pushing inclusive growth on our trading partners, whether it's with the US or with China. How do you make this work?
So I don't know. I would challenge the premise a bit in that I don't know that we are pushing it on anyone. I actually, in terms of our very first meeting at the White House and with the president after he was inaugurated, we put together a Canada-US Women's Business Council. And that was something we did in partnership. And I think because there is a common something, and we see this with our G7 partners, we see this with China, we see this with many, if not most countries around the world who are interested in strengthening their middle class and ensuring people don't slip out of the middle class and ensuring more people are able to join it. And if you're focused on that, then one of the key drivers we know to strengthening our middle class and to growing our economy is ensuring that more people are participating in the workforce. And we know that one of the areas that there are less people participating is women. We know that it's beyond women as well. We know that there are a number of groups of people who are not participating fully. And so when you're approaching it through that lens, that's a conversation that most countries have been very engaged in wanting to have.
Good. Okay. Excellent. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to go over to Slido. I think I have the code here. I think you have it already, though, K352, if you want to ask questions to Katie on Slido. So the upcoming G7 in June will also focus on inclusive economy and inclusive growth. What will be the most challenging issue that the G7 will have to tackle to make progress towards inclusive growth?
I think probably the most, there's a number of challenges, not surprisingly. I suspect, we're just, as I said, we're just at the beginning of the ministerial sort of process that leads into the G7 summit itself. But I suspect on inclusive growth, one of the great challenges will actually be figuring out how to connect, as it is with, I think, most summits, is how do you connect what they're talking about there and communicate it in a way that goes beyond the summit bubble, that leads to action on the ground, that means that not only people in the public policy forum world that are probably paying much closer attention than others, but even in this world truly know what is happening in those rooms, what they're agreeing to, how the work can flow from the summit. So I think it's almost less focusing on the theme, as I said in answer to your last question, and more, how do we make this real for people? How do we, going back to the first question, sustain any of the efforts we agree to so that it's not a one-off summit, but that can actually lead into the G7 summit in France next year, where we know that they also have an interest in advocating for and creating great change in terms of inclusive growth. So I think the challenge is more in the execution than it will be in focusing on the theme and wanting to find ways to work together.
Yeah, okay, good. All right, so we're going to move to Slido. Oh, we have lots of questions.
There's lots of anonymous questions.
Anonymous. Who's going to put their name to it? Let's vote up the ones that people put their name to. Oh, look at the one that's highly voted. Okay, I want to answer this one too. So I'm hearing because of MeToo, men are fearing taking meetings alone with women or mentoring women. Are you seeing this, and what can we do to end this?
So it was actually the Canada-US Women's Business Council in their, I think it was their second, it might have been their third report. They've been putting out sort of segments on different themes of reports where they actually included research that talked about that discomfort. And the research astounded me, to be honest. I didn't realize until I saw that, the report, quite how significant the concern was out there. And so it caught my attention, and I've engaged in more conversations since then on the subject. And one of the things that has come out of it for me is that there's discomfort on both sides. And it's an uncomfortable conversation. And it goes back to, the MeToo movement, creating these uncomfortable conversations, but that I genuinely believe are going to lead to a much more comfortable workplace. Once we get some of these things out there, talk about them, find resolutions to them, we will be in a better place. And so on this subject, I think the very fact that many people felt that way, and I didn't realize, and I don't know that other people realize it, and that's why it's becoming a more talked about thing. And so when I say, it affects both genders, I was at, when the Prime Minister travels around the world, we have roundtables with business leaders who happen to be women. And he's done that in China and in India and across the United States and in Europe, and they've been some phenomenal sessions. And in one of the more recent ones, it was, and there are of course Chatham House rules types of conversations. There was a CEO who said, from North America, who said, and actually Canadian, so that there's not an assumption it's an American, who said, my firm, my business has tickets to sporting events. 2, you put in your name quick when they become available to be able to take your client out. And as a senior woman, even in my firm, it can be awkward now, especially with the current dialogue, to call up a man to come out with me. Like, does he call and ask his wife for permission first? How does this go? Is it a date? Is it not a date? How do you clarify these things? And in some ways, her telling that story, and then I've repeated it a few times, and it's gotten men telling their stories back about, well, how do you think we feel? And I think we have to accept, it goes to sort of unconscious bias training and all of these things, we have to accept that we all have different degrees of concerns. Some, more right than others, but we're not going to unpack them or understand them or know how to move on from them if we don't create a safe space to talk about them in the first place. And I think workplaces have a responsibility, including mine, to do that, to have these conversations, to figure out, and I don't think there is one perfect way to solve for any of these things, and I think we have to be prepared that we're going to make some mistakes along the way. But that if we don't try to have some out in the open conversations, we're not going to learn from mistakes, and we're going to keep having these sort of dark fears that lead to further separations of genders in the workplace. And that's obviously the opposite of what we all want to see happen.
Yeah, so creating the space to have those difficult conversations, absolutely. So GPA Plus was always a requirement of policy proposals. What's different now that we're actually looking for it?
I think, I can't speak to how it was beforehand, so you'll have to have the clerk up here for that. And
that was his question. He's anonymous.
I think that I certainly believe we talk about it a lot more than we did, and that in and of itself is both publicly and privately. And that in and of itself, the challenge function even between ministers and political staff. There was a competition last year on which ministers' offices could get the most people certified in GBA plus analysis, the fastest. And I think there is more attention paid and more people engaged in the conversation, frankly, beyond the status of women department. But further than that, the status of women department, I think, has also been given more attention and permission and license to push everyone else more. But not only that, but to be integrated into conversations across the government. There were some columns written following the budget where I watched some pundits say on Twitter, because I do check, and where they said, they quote tweeted, "Status of women worked on the budget with finance," as if it was a bad thing. Why would, and it was a very gendered I took it actually as a very gendered comment, that it was saying, for some reason, this small department, because it is a small department relative to others, should not have been involved in the budget. And I restrained myself in that instance in terms of getting into it on Twitter. But I will say that I am extremely proud of the fact that Status of Women was as involved as they were in the budget, because they have an expertise and an experience, as this anonymous person was saying, in the GBA plus analysis. So actually having them directly involved, being fresh eyes to finance, being a challenge function, and being at the table to really apply that analysis thoroughly, I think is actually the government taking great strides in ensuring that finance isn't, operating in a bubble and not taking these other perspectives into account.
Mm-hmm. The constant challenge function. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of underrepresented groups in politics more broadly, given that the barriers exist, how do we encourage more people?
So I think my experience has been we have to be creative, and we have to ask a lot. So one part of that answer is boring and simple, which is if there's anybody that that you think could be interested or good at politics, you should suggest it to them. Too often, nobody suggests it to somebody in the first place. And if they only hear it once, because you only mention it once, then they probably think it was an in-the-moment thought. And especially women, and I would say women of color even more so, the research tells us very clearly that you need to ask many, many times. This is very dated research, what I'm about to say, so I do need somebody to tell me what the up-to-date research would say, but I know prior to the last election, when I looked at the research, it was saying 14 times it took to ask a woman to run before you got a yes. Minister Freeland would be case in point on that. I think that in terms of even more diverse communities, though, to speak about Selena, who is our wonderful parliamentary secretary to international development, and she's someone who came through us essentially experimenting. I see Marlene smiling because she was with me through all of this, and we just, it was actually a volunteer who came to us, and this is about being open to new ideas and having these conversations, including the uncomfortable conversations of, we don't have the diversity we want. We don't have the number of women we want. This doesn't embody us, so what do we do? What do we try? And a volunteer who happened to be a woman said, I think we should do a call out. And we should have a ask her to run, essentially, kind of campaign. And so we put out an email that said, do you know somebody? Because that's something, and we've actually applied a little of this learning to the Senate selection process now, where we give the opportunity to people to nominate somebody else, to organizations to nominate somebody else. Because too often, minority groups and people and women will not put their name forward in the first instance. So, think about that in terms of your recruiting and your hiring as well. So we put this out and said, do you know anybody? And here's our commitment to you in terms of what we'll do on the follow-up. The follow-up will is give us their email. We will then just email them. We will not put them on the email list that gets, the daily email from the party and everything else. We will just email them and ask them if they would be interested in a conversation to learn more. We will tell them that you suggested that they are a leader in their community and could be really great in politics, and would they be interested in a conversation? We got dozens and dozens and dozens of responses. I believe it was in the hundreds, but I'm hesitant to say that because it's been a while since I've reflected on that particular experience. But Selena was someone who came through that process. And she actually put up her hand so quickly that she ran in a by-election. Didn't quite work out the first time for us, but we learned lots of lessons. And then got elected very successfully in Whitby in 2015. Mm-hmm. But I think really the lesson from that, or the lessons from that, there's often more than one, was the reaching out the listening for creative ideas, the asking those uncomfortable questions, because nobody likes to necessarily admit that they have something missing or that they're not doing something right. Trying it, being prepared that it could have failed, and frankly, were the percentages coming off of it amazing? No, but even having one MP out of it and several other candidates was something. And then learning that lesson about the importance of opening it up for people to suggest other people over email, and then making it very clear what degree of follow-up we would actually provide or not provide.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we live the same thing here all the time in terms of speakers. You know, countless times we ask women to be on stage to speak as an expert, and so many times they recommend their male colleagues who they might feel have a deeper expertise, and it happens time and time again. So needing to ask twice, needing to ask again, and needing to seek out those individuals, and so important.
Mm-hmm. I'm always curious which one she's going to pick. I can see all.
Yeah, well, there's the popular ones, and then it's like, So I'll just go with the one that's been voted up with the most successful argument, the need for better representation of women, the economic case, the moral, other.
So it's interesting right now, actually, to get that question, because something I've been spending some personal time really reflecting on and talking about with some friends and colleagues is that there is a debate on that subject again, and it goes in all directions depending on who you're talking to as to which is the appropriate case. I think we went through quite a period of time where, at least in rooms and circles like this, the business case was the case. And then I would say a few years back, there started to become a push, particularly from the advocacy community, that we shouldn't have to make a business case. Mm-hmm. It's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And so I started to see a bit of a shift in that direction, and both arguments being made. And it's actually, though, interesting. I found those groups quite polarized from each other, which always bugs me a little bit, because we are trying to do the same thing and achieve the same thing. I think both cases need to be made. I mean, as the Prime Minister has said, you know, when he has a line that I'm absolutely going to get wrong now, but that you know, it's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And the smart thing is the business case. I think you have to do both, but I think that we absolutely cannot drop the business case. I think the business case is what brings everyone along with the conversation, whether it be other countries, whether it be men and women. I think it provides also a safer conversation about it to have, that it's not telling people something that could be deemed threatening almost, that this must be done, or scolding, that it's actually suggesting an opportunity and saying, and a shared opportunity. Because it is about growth for everyone. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, has to be part of the messaging, because we need men and boys to be advocates as much, if not more than, women are on this quest for equality, or we won't find it. And so I think we have to be approaching it as a shared opportunity, which means it has to be something that isn't scolding or preaching or threatening, but rather something that can be a shared objective.
I like that.
And not only because men have daughters, right? I mean, that's often how it becomes a shared objective, and that's an amazing thing when men have daughters and can rely on that experience. But we need all men, including men, and especially men with sons, to be on that mission with us.
And feminists with sons.
Exactly.
I was caught up by the beginning when you mentioned that in your personal time you debated this, and I kind of wondered how that happened.
How do I have personal time?
And what about the argument around...
Often while watching Paw Patrol. So.
What would you say around the argument around the women CEOs being oversubscribed? If you talk about the Tina Lees and the Linda Hasenfrantz and the Dawn Farrells who are out there being ambassadors for Canada, leading their organizations, and how do you respond to that in terms of...
That they're awesome. And that we need, It's been it's one of many great privileges in my position is getting to know some of both my position, but I sometimes say I have two jobs or two hats that I wear. One is Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister of Canada, which in and of itself is a very unique and privileged honor, really, to have that role. And then the other role, which is also almost, if not more unique in a different way, is to be a woman Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. Because I am not the first, I am the second. I am the first appointed by a man. And so you can guess who the other one is. Because of that, and I get asked to do things like this, and I feel that if I don't speak up on these issues, who will? And so there's, and I think our ministers feel that way too. And so that's why we want to have these conversations, both so that we can learn by being out there and also hearing back what the questions are. When I get questions like that last one about how do we make the case, it means there is a question about literally how to make the case still. Mm-hmm. And these are important reminders for us to have. But I do think that women in positions of power, which those CEOs obviously are, and many in this room are, we have a responsibility to speak up, to speak out, and to reach out and bring more women in. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, to partner with the men that we work with. And I'm incredibly fortunate on that front, in that I have a Prime Minister who knows I'm off doing this at the moment and encourages that, and of course is the biggest champion of all around me on these issues and pushes me more on them when I sometimes, the odd time I'll think, okay, maybe pull back a little in terms of my own, excitement, we'll call it sometimes. And then, of course, I work with Jerry and have for a long time, and the clerk, and these are all men who have been changing. It is not me, in the way that, even though I appreciate the introduction, it is very much a team. And as I said, I think it's that much more important that these men are the champions for this change. Mm-hmm. Because it also gives permission to we women to keep advocating for it too. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for being relentless. We notice it. There's lots of tangible change.
That's the word I should have gone.
And you are relentless, and we appreciate it.